All right, good morning to those who are with us and to those who are watching the video after the fact. It's our March Conversation Cafe, and we're continuing the theme for the year on practical management. In January, we talked about practical management as a craft in general, so the kind of full scope of practical management, and we thought about it as strategy, design, change, leadership, teams, in cohorts, in small groups, in company. And then in February, we started to zoom in on aspects of this, starting with design. We looked at managers as designers of organizations. And in March, we've been exploring managers as decision makers. This is probably not the most exciting topic in management, and yet, as we'll see, it's central to management. And much like all other areas of management today, the kind of foundational stuff sometimes gets overlooked, I think. When I tested the idea of decision-making and asked myself, which aspects of management does decision-making affect? I had to make most of the modules green. So there's decision-making in strategy, there's decision-making in design, there's decision-making in change, there's decision-making in leadership, and there's decision-making in teams. So that kind of geared me up to expect something kind of interesting to come out of the conversation. Welcome. We're going to talk a little bit about how central decision-making is to managerial identity and how managers actually make decisions. And with the yesterday, today, tomorrow theme, I was curious to know, has managerial decision-making changed? And what did it look like in the past? What does it look like today? And where is it going in the future? And that means we have to think a little bit about how organizations have evolved as well. It's a very small group today, so we're going to try to include the conversation in plenary, not necessarily push everybody out into breakouts. And the invitation to anybody on the call is unmute and ask a question, or unmute and contribute when you want to, or I'll start out with a breakout question. And the question I want to lead off with is moments at work where things could have gone wrong and what you did. Zonke, you led up in while we were building up to the call, just talking about solving a problem with coal cutting and how things were going wrong, and how you approached that. I don't know if you want to share that again very lightly, because I think it's a beautiful story of managerial decision-making. Could have gone really badly, and it turned out really well. Is there anything you want to share about that while we're on the recorded part of the call? We don't have to give too much detail.
Hi, Craig. I've got the line managers joined under Zonke. That's why you see everyone, it's Zonke Zondi.
Hello, everybody.
I'll rather give them this platform to narrate the stories, because it's about them, actually. So I would like to request one of the managers to respond to your question. I even have the mine manager who has joined as well.
Oh, welcome. What is the mine manager's name?
It's Mighty Mtweni.
I'm Mr. Tweni. I was telling Zonke a story about how my grandfather was a mine manager in the same area that you're working in, obviously in the 1950s, maybe 1960s. Very interesting part of our family story and very central to my mother's growing up. Yeah, think about moments at work where things could have gone wrong and what you did. You don't have to share
it. Yeah, morning. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity to join this platform. Am I audible?
You are very audible. Thank you very
everyone
much.
here? Yes. Yeah, I think one of the things that I can think of which happened recently, we had rain, and then we've got our security guys that are controlling the traffic in and out on the boom gate. But the rain caused some slippery condition with the security guys. So there was a possibility of personnel interacting with moving equipment, and any disastrous situation could have resulted into that. So I advised the security guys to keep the gate open and then allow the vehicle to go in and out unsearched. And I've made that decision solely because it was based on safety. It was based on saving life. So so far, I think that's one decision that I can think of that just happened recently. Okay.
Safety is so central. You know, I was telling Zonke that my grandfather's career, you know, he made his way to mine manager, and then there was an accident and lives were lost, and it affected him so significantly that he developed alcohol problems, and you know, that was pretty much the end of his career. That incident in which lives were lost, he couldn't deal with it, and he exited the mine with consequences, obviously not just the consequences of the accident and the loss of life, the consequences on him, his family, and so on. So decisions where clearly in your site, the objective of human safety is primary. There's some sort of goal that lives must be saved, and then decision-making flows from that. Thank you for the share.
Thank you, Greg.
Anything else that anybody else wants to maybe share about a moment at work recently where things could have gone wrong and what they did? Then let's move. So hopefully that's an example, by the way, of that efficacy discussion where you think about something in the past and think about how you've dealt with it. And we realize that, you know, my starting point on preparing for this, as I said, was yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So, you know, please don't be surprised if some of the references are very yesterday. And as far back as 1960, Herbert Simon said, he thinks decision-making and managing are the same thing. That managing is decision-making. It's the reason we have managers. And I did stop to think about that a little bit. I asked myself, surely management is more than decision-making. And then I realized that I couldn't think of a situation where management was more than decision-making, depending on how you define, you know, decision-making. So that was interesting. And it led me to then ask, what is the history of the decision-making process? How do managers actually make decisions, and how might that change over time? So again, we've got Herbert Simon writing look at that fantastic title on the left-hand side, The New Science of Management Decisions. And he's writing that in 1960. And he says the work of a manager is made up of those three steps on the left: intelligence gathering, designing alternatives, and then making a choice between those three things. And he's very clear that when you then move to implement your choice, you're just repeating the same cycle. As you're implementing your decision, you still gather intelligence, you know. I guess in the case of the mine safety incident during the rain, the intelligence gathering identifies it's raining, it's slippery, there's risk to the security personnel. What are the options? Well, the options are that they continue stopping and searching, or they're opening the gate. Two alternatives. You choose to open the gate, and then you continue to gather intelligence. Even as that's being implemented, you can check, has safety conditions improved? Do we think we're at risk of any loss or any issues at the gate? And that intelligence gathering, design, and choice cycle just keeps repeating. And Simon wrote quite extensively about, in the New Science of Management Decisions, about this idea of gather intelligence, design options, and make choices. And he felt that that was the work of a manager. If you fast forward to a classic text on organizations, Gibson, Ivancevich, and Donnelly's book called Organizations, I think had its last reprint or last edition was the 14th or the 15th edition. But back in 1982, they were in the 4th edition. So this is these are researchers and writers on organizations that have endured over quite a long period of time. And in 1982, they said, here's a decision-making process. This is the steps that managers go through. It starts off with objectives or goals. So there's some purpose, some goal. And we heard in the case of the mine, there are clearly competing goals, keeping a handle on what's coming in and out of the gate. And then there's a goal of safety, which one prioritizes. And we hear that the prioritization was safety. And then you've got to measure, you measure, how's our safety track record, or how are we doing against production targets, or how are we doing against losses at the gate? So objectives and measurements are the absolute starting point of all decision-making. Not personality, objectives and measures. And then based on the measures, you identify problems. So you realize, we've got a problem with safety. We've got a problem with production. We've got a problem with losses. And then you start to design alternatives. So that was develop alternative plans. Then you make a choice, choose an alternative, and then you implement that decision, and then you control and evaluate. And as boring and as dull and as absolutely what seemingly obvious as it is, that's the starting point of the discussion on managerial decision-making yesterday, today, and tomorrow. This is the work of a manager. This is what they're supposed to do. Now, when I was preparing this, Liesl, who's on the call with us today, talked about, she'd just done a couple of days worth of work on personality effects on management. And that group of managers had felt that personality must make a difference. I was amazed by a story that I think Simon wrote about also back in the 1960s and 70s. He was asking himself in the science of management decisions whether personality makes a difference. And this is the story he tells. In a juvenile detention facility, so basically kind of a prison for young offenders, conditions were, on the one facility, very bad. It was run like in a very military way. And these children were quite brutalized. You know, they had to be silent, they had to file in. He tells the story of how they monitor these children through the shower system. Nobody's allowed to talk. They go to the dinner, nobody's allowed to talk. Everybody has to ask permission to leave. And then he's got a different juvenile facility, also run by the same group of companies, by the way, where it's much more relaxed. What they were interested in is, why does this one run so harshly? And they assumed that was the personalities of the people who worked there. That the people who worked there were the kind of people who like things to be harsh. So what they did was they interviewed a bunch of the people who had applied for jobs there before they got the job. And they interviewed those people and asked them how they felt about juvenile detention. And they were very surprised to see that most of the people were quite liberal. They felt that the children should be given a chance to find their identities, to get psychological safety, as we talk about today, to build up psychological capital, to have a sense of hope, because they felt that many of those children came from broken homes and they wanted to give them stability. So they had these very liberal views. Then they interviewed them again 6 months after they started working in this environment. And all of them had flipped to, this harsh way of managing is the only way to manage these kids. Of course, they did the same thing in the other institution, where there was already a culture of decision-making and working with the children that was much more liberal, and the liberal attitudes retained. So what they saw straight away was, there's something about the culture of the place that affects how these decisions are made, and it is much more powerful than the personalities of the people who are coming in. That basically you modify your personality to fit the way things are currently being done in the organization. So yes, I agree, Liesel, there may be personality effects. But in the same way that people often talk about culture eats strategy for breakfast, culture eats personality for breakfast too. It seems. But maybe that's something that you want to think about. So then we move on. Simon says, all right, if that's a decision-making process, he's still back in 1960-70, he's the first one to identify that we've got two kinds of decisions, really, or two extremes. There's program decisions. These are the decisions that are routine. They're highly structured. They're rule-based. And we handle them through procedures or systems. And examples would be, how do you inspect a vehicle at the gate of a mine? How do you run a process in a process plant like Sasol's? How do we process a banking application for a retail banking client? Those kinds of decisions are routine, structured, rule-based, and then they're handled through procedures or systems. Then we get at the other extreme, non-program decisions, where it's kind of new. It requires judgment. And we got an example, live example from the mine of, how do I choose between kind of production and dispatch control and human safety? I must make the judgment call. I choose safety, and we stand down for a while. So these are strategic choices or crises or innovation decisions, and they're on the other side. And what we want to ask ourselves is, does the decision-making process change then? Does the idea that there are goals, identify problems, develop alternatives, choose alternatives, implement decision, control, and evaluate, does it shift between a programmed decision and a non-programmed decision? And for those of you who are interested, we can also see the birth of the complexity science work here, which obviously matured from the 1950s as it drew from life sciences. The program decisions would be what the Cynefin framework calls the ordered spaces, and the non-program decisions is what the Cynefin would call disordered or complex spaces. Well, is that enough for us to move on? Well, not quite. For those of you who've been following at WorldsView, you know that we like to think about organizational forms and forces. We might ask ourselves, does the form of the organization change the decision-making process? But we decided to go a different route for today. And we want to introduce a woman who maybe doesn't get the recognition she deserves, Joan Woodward. So at about the time that Simon is starting to think about decision-making, Joan Woodward, this wonderful woman, has started an investigation into 100 companies. She's analyzing or researching 100 companies between 1955 and about 1965. And she's trying to figure out what is it that makes one company successful and another not successful. She starts out by thinking that maybe it is the form or the forces. Is it the size of the company? And in the end, she realizes that it's the technology with which they produce. And I'm trying to explain that to you in a second. Different operating systems develop different forms or different approaches to managerial decision-making. And let's go and have a look at that for a second. So back in the day, you've got managers trying to drive towards standardization. Think about it. You've got the first industrial revolution leading on to the second industrial revolution. There's an absolute explosion in managerial behavior. Before the first and the second industrial revolution, you just didn't need the amount of managers that we had, that we now see, because most production was relatively small. But by driving processes, driving work over to the standardized side, you could build up scale. And as you built up scale, you added managers. And what do I mean by driving something to the programmed side? I want to give you a simple example of what I think the work of a manager was back in those days. So we get the story in about 1990 of a very new manager, so a first-line manager that we think about today, in a relatively small firm that is producing personal computers. So they assemble them and then retail them, and they also repair them. And they have two technicians in a workshop who are either doing assembly or doing repair. And what this manager finds is that there's huge quality problems. The clients are complaining that repairs take too long, and then there are times when the assembly is faulty and the machines are not to standard. So you've got quality issues all over the place. And the manager has a look. Obviously, the objective measure here is reduce the customer complaints on repairs and increase the amount of machines that are ready for sale first time, so are working on dispatch. It identifies that the problem is the way of work of the technicians, and just creates two simple assembly lines, two lines. One line for repair, one line for assembly, and then has three simple rules. Rule one, tag the machine. Is it here for repair, or is this a new assembly? Repairs go on this line, assembly goes on that line. The second rule was that each item stays on its line to conclusion. And the third was that technicians could choose which line they worked on, because volumes at that point were very small, but they had to work on a line at a time. And those three things moved from an environment where everybody was putting everything anywhere or working on anything in any space, causing confusion, to a more routine, structured program decision. And then, of course, as that unit scaled up, they kept the lines separate. They started to hire differently on different lines. Now, this sounds obvious today, but that was a manager making a decision to shift something from a novel, ambiguous, non-programmed space over the course of a few days into a programmed space. And that allowed standardization, that allowed scale, problems reduced, volumes increased, and so things grow. So what do we get? We get process and batch work starting to emerge yesterday. This is again in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s. What do we mean by process and batch? Well, process work is that continuous process where you kind of switch on the machines in the morning and switch them off in the evening. Highly standardized, and the more it standardizes, the less managerial input we needed. You can see that objectives and measures were increasingly programmed, that they came from technostructure, production control. What did identify problems look like? It looked like people monitoring machines. They were watching the machine. That's how you would identify a problem. Something's wobbling, something's scratching, something is not producing the right amount, something's too hot, something's too cold. But they monitor those machines. Now we're in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then what is the alternative? Well, they actually would escalate. Most times, if it wasn't as simple as turn down a valve or turn up a valve, they'd have to report something's gone off track, get an instruction, and implement the updated instruction. And you can feel how man and machine really just started to entwine on that end. On the other end, you've got unit and small batch production still going on, and the old master-apprentice model continuing. So apprentices learning from masters in very small production environments, making one-off items. So that's that process, batch, and unit production start to separate. And this is what Woodward says completely defines the organization. What you must have is an operating system and decision-making process that matches the environment you're in. And if you do it properly, you'll be the best production organization. But you can see how decision-making over on the process and batch side really becomes about watching the machine and monitoring the machine. So what happens today? Well, I know the slide looks a lot noisier, but it's really pretty much the same sort of thing. Over on the left-hand side, where we've got process and batch production, its objectives and measures are increasingly programmed. I mean, it's just crystal clear that you're trying to produce more of something or better of something. Identifying problems does involve monitoring machines, which is more and more automated. Those machines are more and more talking to each other or monitoring each other and flagging issues through PLC systems, control loops kicking in. The alternatives are already programmed, if too hot, then turn down valve. And that kind of if-then programming kicks in and the machines self-adjust. And maybe there's an updated instruction to cool or heat, which is machine implemented. On top of that, on the left-hand side, you've got artificial intelligence now coming in. So really able to prepare simulations and scenarios on programmed environments, known environments where you've got 10, 15, 20 years worth of data, and increasingly automated, less and less humans in that loop. And I think that is true from modern mining environments to modern production factories, And increasingly, we'll see on the other side of the equation in the novel spaces. So what's the bottom line there? Today, everything that was a programmed batch or process production line is increasingly automated, and all the judgmental decision-making is being reduced through analysis and AI. And we are likely to see management going through its second extinction on this side. And I'll say second extinction, I'll explain why in a second. On the other side, in the unit production end, we've got two different worlds happening side by side. That master apprentice model is still there in a lot of small businesses. So that person who started the small company sets the objectives, identifies problems, has solutions, and dictates the action. And we still see that, still hear it. You know, we had a call recently with some young managers on it, and their answer to every question we asked them was, I wait for my manager to tell me what to do. And by their manager, they meant the owner and the guy who started the business. So that master apprentice model still very much alive. But right next to it, you've got more enlightened firms where teams are collaborating to define objectives. Teams review in daily stand-ups, you know, that agile kind of environment. Teams are reviewing for problems. Teams are developing or designing possible solutions and then arguing in the team meeting about whose design is better. Teams are choosing and evaluating alternatives and then moving off to implement. So we've got very much this kind of human space still staying in the unit and small batch environment, and increasingly automated and AI decision-making in the batch, large batch, mass production and process environments. Again, if you're in those environments, that's not news to you. Does it change the decision-making cycle? I don't think it does. But it changes the way we deal with each of the steps in the decision-making cycle. So where does that take us then? Well, we look at a couple of examples to try and make it real. Retail banking. If you're in a retail bank, the objectives and the measures are completely given to you by the technostructure. You know exactly that you're trying to win more customers or increase margin or get customers to take on a new product, but there are very few objectives and measures that are human driven in the middle management or frontline management space. Identification of problems, all monitored by the technostructure. So you've got compliance people monitoring with their compliance systems. You've got risk people monitoring. You've got revenue analysts. You've got actuaries, all of them figuring out what's going on. And alternatives are developed by the technostructure. Alternatives are chosen through the technostructure. And, you know, you ask yourself in the end, what is it that managers do in a retail banking environment as it more and more rapidly automates? The most extreme example, you know, retail banking is now pretty much a process environment. And the most extreme example is Time Bank. Time and other banks have, you know, launched no branch, no people banks. You go to a kiosk, you open a bank account. It's effectively the whole process is handled by a machine, and all decisions are programmed in the background. You've got a very small, very powerful technostructure, but customers interface with machines. School's still out on whether that's going to work for them as a retail bank, but it does prove the case that retail banking, like so many other white and blue collar environments, are moving faster and faster into process as 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years of history teach us how we can program, how we can eliminate uncertainty, and how we can run the cheapest and fastest and largest possible operation. So retail banking. What about pharmaceutical manufacturing? Well, firstly, the objectives and measures in pharmaceutical manufacturing are given by good manufacturing practice. There's global standards on, and rightly so, on what kind of quality we expect from medication that's going to be dished out to people. So you'll have this combination of good manufacturing practice determines how that pharmaceutical plant or factory should work, and then you've got corporate goals. And those two create the tension at the objectives and measures space. Well, what happens next? Well, identify problems on the plant. That's done by the technostructure and by the public. If you get it wrong on the plant, you'll have the public going to carte blanche and saying, well, you know, whistleblowers are telling us that the conditions on this plant are not really good, if it's food or medicines or whatever the case may be. But when you try and develop alternatives on a plant, you are heavily constrained by capital and by GMP and by corporate. So actually, there's very few alternatives that you are left with that are viable. And then you choose your alternatives based on your infrastructure. This is a batch environment. So why is it a batch environment? Because good manufacturing practice requires that each batch is recorded. You're able to track where that bottle, on what date was it made and what batch number was it made. So if any problem is ever found with that bottle of medicine, that entire batch can be identified and contained. So very much a batch environment in mass production. And when you ask yourself, how much space has management got? I'm talking again, frontline and middle management, to make decisions. It's a highly constrained decision-making space. They've got to be trained on the objectives and measures. They're trained on how to identify problems within GMP and existing processes. But as those plants automate more and more and more, and instrumentation loops identify problems, you get less and less humans moving around the plant and less managers. So decision-making process is still there, increasingly automated. What about municipal road maintenance? This will feel a little bit like cutting coal at the coalface in a way. Because municipal road maintenance is not process or batch. If you think about that pothole on the road or the broken stop sign or the broken traffic light, well, the objectives and measures are given by purpose. This is municipal road maintenance. We want the road to be usable. We want the traffic light to be working to prevent accidents. We want the stop sign working, and so on. So objectives and measures. Are we talking about field teams that are often, men and women running out of a depot with a bucky, literally? They get into the morning, get the bucky loaded up. They know that they're going to be dealing with issues of potholes and traffic lights and whatever over a particular area. And then they've got to go to the site and they've got to visually inspect this pothole. And on the site, they've got to consider what they'll do with their available tools and materials. Based on supervisor experience, they'll figure out what they're going to do today. Am I going to just hammer the existing sign straight again and replant it with a bit of concrete? Am I going to try and take another sign out of the bucky, or do I have to send somebody back to the depot to get a sign? Or how am I going to fill this pothole? They improvise under pressure to implement the decision and use judgment, experience, interpretation, and sometimes a little bit of innovation on how to cut the coal a little better, or how to repair that road, and this could be, the same as the way your hairdresser works. And I know it seems crazy to equate your hairdresser with municipal road maintenance, but I think they're very similar. The hairdresser doesn't scale, and municipal road maintenance doesn't scale into process and batch. It's very unique work. So that's where we are, I guess, today, with 3 examples of how process, batch, or unit changes what we do in the objectives, problems, alternatives, implementation through the decision-making process. but it doesn't seem to change the decision process itself. It seems that that process is pretty boringly obvious and quite reliable. Well, what does that mean then? Where does this take us? Well, it gives us the hypothesis that this is a core process, firstly. So that might stand, and it's true whether you're on the novel, ambiguous side or on the routine or structured side. It highlights what delighted me in the opening conversation from a real live, my manager dealing with real live issues, is that what triggers the decision-making process is objectives and measures. What are the goals and how are we measuring them? And then from there, you can identify problems, develop alternatives, and so on. You can also figure out, which environment are we in, and has this decision fallen to the judgment, non-programmed side, the complex side of the equation, or does it fall on the structured or routine or obvious side of the equation? So maybe touching lightly on then, what do we see today? I'm going to start on the right-hand side. Organizations are trying to get fast adaptive. So org design in this fast adaptive space is trying to change the conversation from objectives and measures. You hear David Snowden talking about directions, not goals. So he says the future is too uncertain to set specific goals. So we set directions. We want to know what we're moving towards. Okay, that's fine. And I think we know there's a whole body of work going on in that space. Then over on the problem identification, we know that more and more people are tending towards participatory sense and respond kind of work. So not one person trying to identify the problem, but trying to work in groups to do that. In developing alternatives, the tendency is to try and find alternatives from other domains. So this exaptation idea, try and solve your mining problem with learning something from the military or from banking. Try and solve your military problem by learning something from sports, that kind of exaptation. In choosing alternatives, the tendency now on the novel ambiguous side is not to choose one alternative. So if you're in that ambiguous space, to choose multiple alternatives. You don't put one bet on everything. You run 3 or 4 safe to fail experiments. And then as you implement that decision, you see which of those experiments can combine, which have to fall away, which you would back. So again, you get a kind of a emergent approach and then control and evaluate. So that seems to be a lot of fields of research happening on that side. On the more routine structured side, as organizations scale up, each unit develops a silo mentality, and those silos push their objectives and measures apart. Seems that's been going on since 1950, and it's still going on in 2026. So as you scale, the challenge of trying to keep the divisions and the organization all operating on the same goals gets more and more difficult. But we also see this. We were talking with Zonke at the start of the call about the confidence to set goals. Certainly in our work, we see more and more managers on the left-hand side basically have lost the agency. They've lost the psychological capital to create goals. They wait for the goals to be given to them. And if you wait for the goals to be given to you, you can't then set goals for your own team or your own unit. You just wait to be told what they are. So there's something that I think is worth thinking about there. Of course, identifying problems in this routine program side, there's data everywhere. I mean, there's just so much signal complexity it's very difficult for managers and decision makers to figure out what matters. And so we see the creep of AI helping to make sense of that signal complexity where humans are struggling with it. Of course, the speed of the entire cycle. So Agile is making these cycles move faster. AI creep. What we see, and I'll talk about it a bit more in a second, is AI is moving out of the routine structured program space and into the novel ambiguous space. So when AI starts to hit here, we'll see something happening to managerial work on this end. And then obviously there are entire fields of research and decision making on ethics and bias. So I don't want to go there. I think enough has been talked about that. Ethics in decision making and bias in decision making. I think in South Africa, the ethical conversation dominates. We know that we've got, corruption issues in many spaces. And then decision bias, of course, is something that we're learning more and more about through neuroscience and neuropsychology. So what does this mean for tomorrow? Well, tomorrow is going to change where the boundary between routine and structured and novel ambiguous sits. Yes, AI is already very good at pattern detection, report interpretation, policy summarization, analytical modeling. It's just, in many cases, it's better than our frontline humans at working on the program side of an organization. And on the judgment side, AI is moving into scenario exploration, option generation, and sense-making support. So, yep, I'm afraid that there's no really good news in that. What does it mean? It means for managers and managerial decision makers, these decision-making steps will continue. Executives in organizations are likely to, still be there. So there's going to be some head of various functions. But we're increasingly going to see AI as manager. Now, as horrifying as this sounds, we must remember that managers are not something that always was and always will be and always should be. Managers arose in the first and blossomed in the second industrial revolutions. So that was like, as organizations scaled up, all the idea of management scaled up. In the third industrial revolution, I don't know if people on the call were there for business process reengineering, which was a really hated practice of many management consultants. But what they really came in and said was, very simplistically, your organization has become more and more routine, more and more structured. Most of the decisions are programmed. We don't need as many managers. And they wiped out layers and layers of middle managers in that third industrial revolution. And things felt like they stabilized for a while. But now in the fourth, as we mature and as AI matures, I expect that we'll see more and more managerial role losses on the program side and the rise of the AI bot and robot as the worker. And on the right-hand side, we expect, I think we should all be thinking about AI-enabled humans as managers, even in arts and crafts and roadside repairs and roadside maintenance and hairdressing. We will see the human plus AI plus bot robot as the worker, and we'll see managerial decision-making continue, but whereas all of the managerial losses here were on this side, not on this side, I think we'll start to see managerial losses and a reshaping of managerial decision-making on that side. So what does that mean then? What does it mean for management development? I want to give you a moment just to try and absorb that. So I'll stay silent for a minute or two. What does that mean? What do managers need? What do you make of all of this? And as soon as you're ready, share what you can share. How shocked are you? How horrified? How hopeful? What does it mean for management development in your organization or in general? What does it mean at WorldsView? What does it mean on a mine? What does it mean in a bank?
Greg, I think what I've been thinking was we always say, because your question is, what does it mean for management development? And we always evangelize that the context is important. And that's why we do management development in cohorts, where it's people from the same context in the same organization, preferably, maybe at different levels from different functions, but working in the same, I guess, industry and culture. So in the same organization, and how helping managers make better decisions in a type of a development program, I think would be more useful if the people in the course are from similar contexts. And I'd be really interested to hear from Zonke and her team what they thought about this, and what the impact of AI is there for them in the team. I know Zonke and your team, we do a bit of work with Caterpillar, and especially in the safety culture space, and most of their clients where they work, where we support, is in the mining industry, and how important safety culture has become, but also how big the shift has been to machines, to like earth moving equipment and so on, that now, where previously a human being was driving the truck, a machine is now driving the truck. And what does this mean for the leaders in the mine, and for the work they do, and how that changes the way they work, the culture, the way they interact, the decisions they make, and so on. And then the change management around that, to get people to say, how do we now do our work, which I guess involves, and how does that impact decision making? So I'd love to hear from some of Zonke's team what they think.
Well, they're thinking about that, Liesl. I mean, the conclusions have to be quite tentative at this point, but I also think the first decision a manager can make is the classic old age one, which is, am I going to automate or am I not going to automate? So that's still a management decision. Am I going to get behind the drive to standardize and process and automate, or am I going to resist and try and remain manual? High human capital or high automation. And I think South Africa as a nation is still wrestling with this, because every one of the industries that starts to automate cuts into employment. And we know that's, and we feel it, If you're in an industrial concern in South Africa, you might have been holding out, resisting the technology drive. But if you're in a competitive marketplace, all that happens then is that other countries' manufactured goods or industry goods or services arrive on our shores cheaper. And as much as we want to say to our customers, hey, we're staying manual so that we can create employment, the customer's going, well, that's fine, but I can buy the same thing for half the price. So I'm going over there. And good luck with your manual thing. So there's the first problem for managers, is this like terribly human dilemma of, do we try and keep employment, or do we automate? And unfortunately, if you fight against automation, in the end, you still lose, because then the whole thing's gone. And the second choice is, okay, if I get behind the automation thing, how do I look after people as we're going through wave after wave over time of human retrenchment? Because the more the processes standardize, automate, the machines start to run things, the less people are employed. The less people are employed, the less need for managers, the less need for, and how do we deal with that human fallout? So decision-making, yes, then means the decision-making process is what it is. You try to be logical, you try to make a decision, but the consequences of where we are, as you say, the context, not just the context of the company you're in, the context of the fourth industrial revolution, AI emerging everywhere, digitization of all sorts of processes, automation of machines able to talk to other machines. As you say, GPS located assets that can not only drive the machine without a human operator, but actually can operate under better conditions than with a human operator, because the precision control of levels and cuts doesn't have human operator variation. I think the future of management in the fourth industrial revolution boils down to maybe either rapidly, as a manager, figure out how to work with the technology, and then your managerial career at least has a chance of rising to the executive layer that remains as more and more below that gets automated. But if you choose as a manager to say decision-making is still decision-making, but I'm going to lean as hard as I can into the technology end and still try and take care of people along the way, which I don't know how, it's difficult, you've got a future. But in 10 or 15 years' time now, if the trend continues, we will have probably maybe 20%, 1 in 5 managers will still have jobs in 10 or 15 years. And I mean, 1 in 5 managerial roles will still be there. The rest will have been gone. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to that. And I've got a closing thought in a minute, but just an invitation to the archive team, if they, I overlooked team, if they want to add anything or any other questions.
Hi, Craig. I think the introduction of AI as part of the 4IR has brought about good things as well as bad things. From an HR perspective, it has proven that with AI, you are able to do the recruitment quicker and faster. But from an employment point of view, it has brought about a lot of retrenchment, because when machines are automated, then you then have to retrench people, because machines are able to do the jobs that have been done by people. I remember when the AI was first introduced, it was said that the first robot to have a human factor was Sophia, who was then given a citizenship. I think it was Saudi Arabia at that time. But now we've got the likes of Siri that are able to tell you where to go, where to take the short left, and so on and so forth. So it's a good and a bad thing. It's good that it increases efficiency in a working environment. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was also a mining company in Australia where saying that the machines underground are not now being operated by humans. And by so doing, they have decreased the rate of fatalities and the rate of safety incidents. But in our case here in South Africa, I think it's going to take a very long time for us to get there. We might get there, but slowly but surely. But at the same time, we've got other legislation or laws that are are fighting for the retrenchment of employees, for instance, the likes of employment equity, because we are told that we've got a high employment rate. So if we now have to automate everything, then it means there will be like a large number of people that are going to be unemployed. If you go to the banks of lately, sometimes you don't even find the tellers. You have to do things your own, because in one bank you will find that there's only 2 tellers. If you go to restaurants like KFC, like McDonald's, you now have to stand on that machine, and then you select the food, and so on and so on and so forth. So you only go to the teller just to collect your food. So I don't know. It's a bit of good and bad, in that it increases efficiency and it increases productivity in a working environment, but at the same time, it lessens the number of people that are supposed to be doing the job. But what I believe in is that there are certain job categories whereby you cannot automate, because in other instances, you need a human touch. You need that feeling, when you speak to someone, the other person wants to see the feeling when you're narrating a story. Whereas with the robot doesn't have, such emotions. So it's going to be, for management, I think it's going to be a good thing, in the fact that there will be like an increase in productivity, but at the same time, the level of decision making will have to happen as in now, So it's a bit of both, I think. Thanks.
Zaki, I'm so delighted that thank you for the full share, and thank you for also balancing, because this is what's interesting for me, is it's not just in environments like underground, or in a factory, or in a food processing plant, or in a beer making plant, where the machines are increasingly integrated. You also had the example of banking, that whole self-service approach, and in the beautiful one in the HR space of recruitment. Funny enough, recruitment was one of the first things when management arose in the first and the second industrial revolution. That small business owner who was now scaling up had to find some staff to support him on recruitment. And I say him because all of those texts in those days were addressed to men in the workplace. And they had human beings going to take over the job of recruitment. Fast forward to 2026, recruitment has become a standardized process. It's got rules. It's got employment equity rules. It's got a list of job requirements. There's no real human judgment anymore in that recruitment process. And so it's automated. And so a machine has started to do it. And a machine has started to do employee disciplinary processes, because they're all scripted and they're all written down. So follow the script, and that's how, it's just, the more we take things and we create rules, which HR has been very good at. HR has created rules and HR has created policies. Well, when those policies have been tested enough, you can get a machine to run them. And that means, I think, there's going to be fewer and fewer spaces where human judgment is left. So what now? What would you do? I have one suggestion for human capital, or human development, or managerial development. And that is what I was chatting to you about at the start of the call. Zonke, we talked about psychological capital. I truly think that understanding and investing in psychological capital, which is available on, as I said, on Google, you can find out how to use it quite easily or work with it, in times of tremendous change, managers will need to understand or believe in themselves enough to get through what they have to get through, whether it's the fourth industrial revolution and all of the pain that comes with that in terms of loss of jobs, restructuring jobs, refocusing jobs, trying to make sense of the world. Psychological capital is a tremendous help. And designing processes, including management development processes around hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism is helpful, in my opinion. Having said that, that brings us to a close on our March focus on decision-making. So we, in January, talked about practical management in general. In February, we looked at org design. In March, we looked at decision-making. In April, we're doing managing performance and accountability, managing performance and accountability. What's happening in there and how can we improve our efforts in managing performance and accountability? So if you want to register for that, you can follow us on LinkedIn or register for our emails. And we'll, if you recall, we publish every single week a topic on this subject, and then we'll build up to the Conversation Cafe at the end of April. Thank you one and all for joining, and look forward to seeing you in a month's time. Cheers, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig and Lisa.